Well, thank you all for coming. It's a beautiful day, so I know that it means a lot to us to have you in this room rather than out in the emerging fall weather. This is the first lecture of the academic year for the program on Reimagining World Order. This program is in its 5th year. We are funded by peers, the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, and our vision is to be an interdisciplinary community, intellectual community studying the big issues of world order, the rise and fall of orders, the history, theory, and contemporary debates about orders, rising powers like China, the debates about rules and institutions that govern the system. So we're kind of a big think group. We do talks of this sort, and then we do an annual conference. We have a podcast. We have two graduate students, postdoc fellow team members, John DeBall, who's here, and Heather Knetzer, who's our graduate student fellow. So we're all here. So we're very glad to have David Ekbladh here to give the talk. He is a professor of history at Tufts University. He's been a very prolific author on the topic of the 20th century and the rise and contestation over world order and the American role in order building. He's the author of 2 books that I want to flag. First off, a book called The Great American Mission, Modernization, and the Construction of American World Order, a book written back in 2010, and a book that really, I think, broke ground in bringing our understanding of how social science, theories of modernization and development that began to emerge in the academy and in liberal circles, you might say, development circles in the 30s and 40s and after the war, became part of the understanding of how the U.S. would build order after World War II. So very much looking at how modernization and the struggle for post-war liberals to envisage a pathway into modernity that would be successful in a world of great contestation over what modernity is and where it's going. And then secondly, a book on plowshares into swords, weaponized knowledge, liberal order, and the League of Nations. So looking back at the 19 teens and after World War I and the League of Nations and the American position in that league. And so rethinking of the 1930s. So today we are very happy to have David speak about his new book, forthcoming book. A slice of it is going to be presented. Look at the World, the birth of American globalism in the 1930s. So without further ado, David, the floor is yours. We very much look forward to your talk. David's going to talk for about 40 or 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up and have a conversation. So David, welcome to Princeton.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for letting me kick off the series this year. It's really a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be here with John. It's done a lot for, not only with this project, thinking about world order, but thinking about liberalism and its place in international politics, among many other things. If he's saying I'm prolific, we bow before you. This is a slice, a mash, a pile heap from this larger project I've been working on for a number of years. And I may as well just get into it and get with the quote that starts the paper. And if you didn't get the paper, apologies for any confusion that it only came out late. I put a vehement disclaimer on the front of it, and there was some question of, well, you gave us a paper, does he actually want us to give it to anyone? And so that's saying that this is draft, and what I'm saying today is pretty well thought out, but it's not a final statement. But what the paper begins with, if you've gotten the paper and you've waded through it, begins with, how did we get this way? And that's a moment for me to say a little bit about how I how I got here with this project is that I actually, when I was finishing my first book, it really frustrated with where the historiography was on the 1930s, particularly the United States. Not that there wasn't good work, not that there hadn't been a lot of good writing over the years of generations on it, but what it was tooled to answer. And I started working on this, and you get into the tropes and terms and jargon of not only the period, but how historians have talked about the period over time, and you see historians recapitulating things that predecessors have left them. And, as I dug in and got into particularly the civil society part, looking away from the government and sort of a set of political figures who kind of tend to dominate things. I mean, not just FDR, but a set of, American officials, and look at people who are actually wrestling with what the problem was in the 1930s. I began to see, like, some of the ways we talk about this period is not really adequate, that there really is a growing sense that the U.S. has a global role to play and better do it actively. And that's what I mean by globalism. Globalism in a scholarly sense, I want to say this as a disclaimer because somebody listening to this on the web might go, globalism, as it's said by, certain political activists and people who live on like 4chan and 8chan, when they say globalists, they mean they can mean things that are anti-Semitic. They can be dismissive of people who think about things outside any kind of nationalistic category at all. I mean how scholars have meant it, which is seeing global forces put together, and that particularly from the U.S. Point of view, right? Understanding how the U.S. looks at a global mission, a global, that the U.S. has a global role to play in maintaining global stability, using its power and influence to maintain that. That's a basic U.S. interest. Sorry for spouting on about that. That just went up, but I didn't know if I had some power to make the summarized. Anyway, all of that said, right? That's what I was after, and what some of the things that were governing what I was exploring. But as I looked at this, that there were a lot of actors saying the problem the U.S. faces in the 30s is a global one, and this might mean the United States has to take on a more extensive global role. Now I've managed to send the sun away.
This is the beginning of his tricks. He has a whole 45 minutes.
I feel like some sort of like an eclipse will appear in the sky. The scholarship should bring light. I think that may be saying something about what my scholarship does. Joking aside, that there were a lot of groups, institutions, individuals talking about increased U.S. global role and seeing that the U.S. was beset by some of the problems it was beset by because of global concerns. And I looked around and I didn't see a lot of other scholars of my generation dealing with it in the context of the Depression years, when things really began to crystallize, I thought. And I was looking around like, am I a little bit crazy here to be thinking this, right? Things that reset some of the standard ways we talk about this, because these people aren't talking in isolationist terms. They aren't talking this way or that, the usual ways we kind of break this down. And thanks to the miracle of the digital world, I stumbled across some of the work of Charles Beard, prominent American historian, probably the most prominent American historian in the interwar years. Powerful voice, right? Even if you've never heard or read Beard, you probably know some of the elements of his economic interpretation of the Constitution, right? That the Constitution is a document for a class to kind of assure its interests. He writes a standard history of a survey history of the United States, the rise of American civilization, that is so popular. He writes a lot of popular works, but Rise of American Civilization, few books have had the kind of breakthrough success where it's something you want seen on your mantelpiece as like a member of the middle class. But all of this is born out of Beard being a very engaged scholar. He's what you might broadly say is a progressive historian, that history is a way to engage social and political questions in the present. And Beard is very much on the non-intervention side of the coin. I mean, he is, in so many words, and we'll talk about this term a little bit, he's an isolationist. I mean, and very proudly so, in some of the ways we might discuss. And he writes a little book. In fact, I stumbled onto this through Harper's archive, Giddy Minds and Foreign Quarrels. It's kind of secondary, secondary one of his publications. And he basically says what I have been discovering in my research. And I'll cause you a little pain and read this out. But it's a very interesting thing because he's looking back from 1939. He's not looking forward, he's looking back. And he's seeing that something's happened, and that there's a ferment. So he writes right before the European war starts. But frenetic preoccupation with foreign quarrels has now reached the proportion of a heavy industry in this country. All our universities have funds and endowments for teaching what is called international relations. And since about 1918, a large part of this instruction has been stripped of all scientific pretensions and has been little more than propaganda for the League of Nations, collective security, collaboration with Great Britain or France, or some kind of regularized intervention by the United States government in foreign controversies everywhere, except perhaps on Worcester or Syria. Hundreds of professors, instructors, assistants, sustained by endowments, lecture to students, forums, women's clubs, academies, and dinner parties on their favorite theme, the duty of the United States to set the world aright. Peace societies, Association for the Study of Foreign Affairs, councils, leagues, and committees for this and that, with millions of dollars at their disposal, are engaged in the same kind of propaganda, openly under the guise of contemporary scholarship. In fact, advocacy for American interventionism and adventurism abroad has become a huge vested interest. The daily press and radio, thriving on hourly sensations, do their best to inflame readers, listeners, and lookers with a passion for putting down the wicked abroad. Foreign propagandists, often well paid by their American audiences, play the same game. And brash young tom-tom beaters in journalism, who know no history beyond a few days ago, write books on the inside of this and that, all directed profit. Say, he puts together some of the things I'm going to try and talk about in the remaining time that I put down in the paper, that there are a lot of overlapping groups and organizations and individuals and voices who are speaking about intervention. The other side in the binary of isolation, internationalism, intervention, right? That I may slip into at points, but that's the other binary, right? And he's saying, often as people do in intellectual and kind of policy and, arguments, the other side is bigger and is better equipped and has, is being well funded. But Beard's not being paranoid. He's seeing that this has happened, and that they do, these various organizations in these various forms and in various media are actually saying something about what the U.S. should be doing in regards to the world and world order, right? Where this intersects with this project is, at the end of this will come out and talk about a particular structure of world order that a lot of these folks end up, right? That's where all of this kind of terminates, right? Like a world order that the U.S. is going to guarantee, U.S. globalism. And again, Beard is famous for his innuendo. If you want to read a nasty takedown of Charles Beard, Samuel L. Morrison does this, but he kind of is right. Beard is, he's often ironic, but very often slings, innuendo about people and kind of half the story. But again, he's right. He's right that these things are evolving, and this flies in the face of some scholarship.
It's not
Oh, it's not. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to my. I'm going to my computer rather than control it. Recent historiography, right, has kind of left. I jokingly call it a dark valley. There's a survey of the Depression called the Dark Valley. But if you look at people like Robert Boyce and Adam Tooze, they tend to say, look, a crisis came upon an American guaranteed or an order that leaned on American credit or American power in some ways, but kind of leaves the story there. And admittedly, those are economic stories. But, whatever the problem is has kind of happened by the beginning, by the time the Depression is really just starting up. And then on another bookend is a recent book by Stephen Wertheim, which basically says it's the fall of France, and American internationalists decide, to go on the march for military dominance globally. And Wertheim says that one of his a little more provocative arguments is isolationism is created as a concept at this moment. And it's not even a Google Ngram kind of question. Isolation is present long before that. People are using it long before that. And they're using it in different ways to understand what the problem is and argue over what the problem is, even before the Depression, but it intensifies in the Depression. It's not created in the 1940s. And it goes to a point, one of the things I'm trying to rectify, which is this sometimes binary that you see very often, not only among scholars sometimes, but very much in the press. It's still in foreign affairs where you can have Condoleezza Rice inveighing against isolationism. This question still kind of comes, it's isolation versus intervention or internationalism. The terms have not been well served often in this debate. And again, it's not that, they're terms that are created in the 40s or intensified in the 50s or during the Cold War to silence critics. They go back, and this is seen even if you go to a quote from Henry Luce that I love. In 1941, he's saying, it is that old issue with these old, battered label, the issue of isolation versus international. It's like, we detest both words. We spit them at each other with the fury of pissy geese, which I just love. That emblem, and coming from New England where the geese are around and they do hiss at you this time of year, it has a particular resonance. But if we can move beyond these categories, right, and see that they're not how they are typically loaded by historians, and also understand that they will crop up, but something broader and different is happening, right? For the internationalists we talk about, right, or the interventionists, there's something that's happening to what they're talking about that isn't merely they're recovering their voice or they're getting into an argument. They're actually expanding what they're talking about. They're talking about things differently, and they're responding to global change. In fact, one part of the book, in that textured way historians like to get into it, it's not even that they're changing their thinking. The Depression's affecting them and their institutions. They're feeling it very personally and professionally, and that's forcing them to rethink the world and their country's place in the world, what the U.S. should do. And it is something that I would give to Stan Katz if he were here. He wasn't able to, I guess, today, but when I was talking to him about this, he's a great scholar of not only law but of foundations and philanthropy. And I was talking about this, and he's like, "Yeah, internationalism is becoming globalist," is what you're saying, and that's exactly, to put it very simply, that is an important part of this. And it's also that these ideas are setting down roots in institutions. They are coming more present in American public debate. But there are spaces and different things and spaces and different institutions, and even just sort of little corners of America where you could find not only internationalist but globalist ideas and support. Right, that's part of talking about. We'll talk a little bit about this, but in the paper where I discuss how these ideas are migrating down from, high-level analysis to corners of libraries in Montana. Anyway, a critical part of this is that liberals, particularly, and people I'm talking about are all liberals in a general sense, liberals come to fear the states that they see as being generated by profound historical change that the Depression particularly represents. I think a difference for Americans, everybody sees the Great War as a great rupture, but Americans more than Europeans see the Depression as the key rupture. And they see this as kind of throwing societies into chaos, and that people choose security, right? They choose security in states and regimes that are statists. They sometimes call it state worship, but they call them dictator states as they see these countries emerge. But it's the real worry that the Depression itself as modern industrial society going off the rails, and that it generates these mutations of society that really worries them. They feel like they feel at sea. They feel that the changes that came with the Industrial Revolution have maybe stopped or gone into reverse or gone off in some crazy direction, and that this is the critical point, right? That this is and these totalitarian states represent something that is the dark opposite of liberal societies. It also becomes a little more perpetual, right? Some of this stuff grafts onto older ideas about tyranny and unaccountable power in American political life in particular. But it takes on this sense that it can happen, as the novel goes, it can happen here. The U.S. is part of the stream of history. And this is a perpetual condition. Totalitarianism can happen to any modern society, and it can happen to us. And it's scary. It puts a lot of these people at sea. And what is profound, you notice, for a lot of these figures, that they're saying this very quickly, and they understand this. And this is part of the sense that if the U.S. doesn't put its hand on the tiller, and control global change, this will eventually come back. I say something profoundly has shifted, and we don't know what's coming next. In a certain way, it's not. It's eerily like the present moment, right? Something's been one way and it's shifted. And this is maybe the point to come back to Beard and the heavy industry. It's that this is not solely. It's not a governmental question. It's entire, right? The U.S. Part of this story is the book does talk about American foreign policy and the way the government and certain parts of the government shift and change too, and official actors. And part of that is that the American state is comparatively small. It does actually kind of lean on some of the actors I talk about as you get closer and closer to World War II. But it's also that it is a story about civil society, right? Just generally, to use just a generalizing term, that it is about different spheres, and particularly four I want to get to today are universities, academia, at what I generally call advocacy, which is basically advocacy groups, which you might call think tanks, but also larger than that, like affinity groups that are out trying to influence society, politics, policy. Media, which is very, very important. In this case, the mass and particularly broadcast media. And then how this all helps by looking at all of this, you can see a migration of ideas into party politics, which is one step from, the state. And, particularly these ideas moving from left to right. So the question for a historian is like, how do I do this? I won't quite say, I guess for the political scientists, everyone's like, what's my case? It's not quite my case, but like, how do I do this? And I tend to gravitate toward individuals. And one of the ways I do this is with Raymond Leslie Buell, who is just a fascinating character for that he covers all of these realms extremely well, and has considerable influence. And one of the points here is like, oh yeah, well, a networked, person of influence, that's not a new thing. True. But one of the points here is that he's also riding a lot of new institutions, ideas, technologies to get his ideas out. But by looking at Buell's a mechanism, right? He's just to kind of, his head crops up or he's working on something that illustrates this larger terrain that is pretty active. And this is one thing I'll say. I create that binary of twos and Boyce and Wertheim. There is stuff in between. A lot of historians have worked on little aspects of this, and some of the institutions or groups or individuals, they haven't quite put it all together. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do with Buell, is to try and be able to say, look, by looking at this figure, you can see how these parts fit together, and you can see something emerging that hadn't been legible before. That Beard saw. So with that, I'll try to get through some of this just to give you an overview. So Buell actually, I'm at Princeton, so I can say this. I usually swallow this because there's a school just down the T that I might offend by saying this, but Buell actually is one of the first scholars of IR. He literally, I love to say this, some of you may know this, he literally writes the book on IR, the first textbook of IR, International Relations, creative with his titles. And, he's very, very influential. He presents at the Institute of Politics. He causes a minor scandal with a book he writes on an important topic, Empire, what's the native problem in Africa, which is largely about, it's not only about European colonialism, it's about mandates and the mandate system and who's doing what. It's interesting, and there's a whole dissertation to be written on that. But it's that he's in the thick of it, right? As this professor of government, at Harvard. But the fun part is that in the late 20s, he writes his parents, he's like, I really don't like the atmosphere here. And doesn't really like Harvard, and takes a job offer from the Foreign Policy Association, itself a new thing, right? And one thing I hurried past, but even, IR is a new thing, right? It doesn't even have a formal school yet, right? There are programs and professorships. I'm from Tufts. I've got to, the Fletcher School will only arrive as the first school of IR, basically, international relations, in 1933. This is a new thing. It's a new interdisciplinary approach that comes out of the Great War. So Buell's already riding something new. Even within, you could argue, maybe stretching a little bit, but the new kind of American research university that's really starting to take off. Not a completely new thing, but this idea of like you're doing a lot of research, and Buell is doing. But he gets tired. He goes to the Foreign Policy Association, which itself comes out at the very end of World War I. As an advocacy group, really centered around the League, but increasingly becomes about educating the American public about affairs. And it's part of a rank of organizations, famously the Council on Foreign Relations, but also actually even before the Great War, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the World Peace Foundation, the League of Nations Association after the war, and a host of other smaller organizations. But these are kind of, larger organizations that are very much in the Venn diagram overlap with scholarship and analysis on IR, but are advocates for the American public and government to understand world affairs better. Now, Buell, when he's first hired, he gives a speech and he says, "Look, there's a fact cult basically in America. In so many words, we're an advocacy group. What we're trying to do is shape opinion, and we have a point of view. We're just going to kind of politely obscure it." They, tend to, the FPA, portrays itself as kind of, non-political, but it very much has an angle. Everybody knows this, what it's aiming for, and that becomes clear. That's already very clear. And, one of the things that will come out in the book is that Buell, throughout his career, is very much actively trying to move things while sounding like he's just giving you what, where analysis leads you. He is very well respected. He, like many figures of his time, has feet of clay on this or that issue. He could be, he's a wonderful thing to look at for looking at what, IR was at the time. And he's more complicated than sometimes occasionally he's portrayed, anyway. But he's extremely well regarded at the time. He very quickly, when the president of the Foreign Policy Association's fascinating figure, James McDonald, leaves, he's made president of the Foreign Policy Association in the early 30s, 1933. And he's fortunate to have step into the research division, which he had run, Vera Michelle Dean at the top there. And Dean also has really an outstanding researcher at her feet, Mildred Wertheimer. And I pulled them out because not only is this a sense of pretty much a straightforward statement that, yeah, there are more diverse voices in this discussion than sometimes we acknowledge. And part of it is actually when you look at the advocacy groups, women some of whom have gotten education in part because of the Great War. Some places are open to women, but they can't go into it's very hard for them to go, and I shouldn't say they can't, very hard for them to go into universities. Very few female professors at this point at all. Some of them go to places like FPA. Dean will be offered deanships at prominent women's colleges. Wertheimer, who dies young, sadly, in 1937, is eulogized by people who say, it's the tragedy that she couldn't get a university position, but she was going to PhD from Columbia. But the point here is also to say you have these very capable researchers who are credentialed in an academic sense, but are writing high-level analysis. Dean is a white Russian immigrant and earns a lot of credibility in the 1920s writing about Central and Eastern Europe, and very quickly gets an international portfolio. But she's structuring the research of FPA and actually other organizations. Part of what's going on in depression is a lot of these organizations are pinched. The Council not quite as much, but the League of Nations Association, World Peace Foundation, Carnegie Endowment, they don't have as much money. They collaborate. They often kind of trade researchers. Wertheimer and Dean get outsized influence in this world because they're experts and these other organizations are using them in their publications. Since I don't have that much time, I'm just going to say they lay down some ideas that many other people recapitulate. Dean, who's at first a little bit complacent about what, the Soviet Union and fascist Italy mean. They offer a critique of capitalism, but they're not a systemic threat. Once the Depression hits and the Nazis take power, she's very clear that something is very wrong. That there's been a rupture, like I mentioned, that there are longer term historical trends that have been broken. Individual, the individual, which liberal societies tend to valorize, has been shaken by all this constant economic, political, and social turmoil, and a lot of people have turned toward statist regimes, and that these regimes are particularly dangerous. And I pulled this out with a volume they do, the FPA does, that Dean writes the foreword to, that encapsulates this. Wertheimer I mentioned because she is on the ground very often. She follows around McDonald, who's High Commissioner for Refugees, works with him, travels to Europe a lot, sees the Nazi regime, and is writing, like in real time, this is a revolutionary regime, guys. This is a dangerous regime. This is broadly shared by people at the FPA. Buell himself will write, we have two different types of regimes. This is a civilizational threat. And it gets to what a lot of other liberals around this circuit that they're in, but also people in the government and elsewhere, are beginning to appreciate much earlier than I think general narratives allow, that there's something very wrong and something profoundly has shifted. Since I've got limited time, I want to skip on to an issue that I'm going to speak about very generally, but gets to the way these organizations get a lot of their ideas and analysis into American life, and that a lot of these more globalist ideas are much more present than we often acknowledge. And that comes around the world economy. One way I approach it is through the raw materials question, which is a question of who gets raw materials and when. In the interwar period, it's very much bound up with empire and colonialism for a lot of reasons. A lot of places that are raw materials, have a lot of raw materials, are controlled by various empires. There's also just a question because of the fragmentation of the global economy. Countries aren't trading as well, or they're dumping raw materials. So it's chaotic. It's part of the chaos of the Depression and the ongoing problem with it. There's a lot of attention to this question, particularly as the have-not powers, right? And what the FBA folks have initially called the dictator states, but particularly Italy, Japan, and Germany, begin to say, hey, we don't have access to raw materials, we can't thrive, we should get our colonies back, or we should get access to this. There's a big argument over this. This draws Americans in. I would actually say it's not only a sign that the Americans are engaged, the Americans are very much, and one of the things I think historians have overlooked is this is also very much in the vein of looking at empire and colonialism. This is very much infused with that. But it's also part of the reason why some parts of the American establishment become a little bit jaundiced about imperialism. They see potentially a repetition of the causes of the Great War. But beyond that, they are looking for ways to ameliorate this question, and particularly after Ethiopia, there's a lot that comes out in IR. And again, one of my points is to say this new set of organizations and scholars and inquiry commits itself to looking at things like, there's this broad category, the raw materials question, books and books published, journal articles, but at this larger concept that went unnoticed is peaceful change, right? We're going to have a regime of peaceful change. And a lot is written on this. There are a lot of meetings convened by FPA, various publications made about how do we solve the problem of the world economy. But just to take away, there's some high-level things that, basically the world economy is very important to people. It's part of the problem, and there are ways we can solve it. And there's this high-level analysis emerging from this higher level, from these organizations and this interaction. And that gets to one of the things these advocacy groups do, and it's amazingly extensive, is FPA charges in under Buell to what they call adult education, popular education, which is there's a longer term tradition in a lot of places, particularly in the United States, of adult education. Some of it's about, Americanizing people. Some of it is about an educational mission and progressive politics. But it really gets amped up in this period. Basically, Buell says, and gets enormous support from foundations, particularly Rockefeller. Carnegie's doing some other stuff too, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The importance of foundations in all of this. To do an education program. And it's where you begin to see where the analysis of people, and there are other people too at FBA, and scholars around this, that FBA starts to put out various books and publications that they subsidize and they give out not just to bookstores, but to high schools, to what the Carnegie Endowment has forged, which are international mind outposts in the comparatively new public libraries, a way of getting research that is made accessible to the public, out to the public, right? Short books, pamphlets, things like this. The endowment is also part of this analysis, like how do we deal with questions in the world economy? They do meetings at Chatham House, the British version of the Council on Foreign Relations. And that leads directly to a really remarkable, almost missionary activity in the American West in the late 30s. Again, one of the things I'm pulling out as a diversity of actors is a lot of this is done by women. And there's just one person who's just fascinating, Ursula Hubbard, who goes all around the Mountain West in the late 30s, convening, meetings, getting students together to talk to them about, what's at stake in world affairs, right? One of the meetings she has is girls, women, and modern world. And one of the things that, to appreciate from this is that one of the things they're trying to convey is these larger questions. A scholar who works on raw materials, I love this. This is the larger point that these shibboleths that internationalists long have are increasingly become, they always have a global connotation, but they take on an immediacy for Americans, which is, the world shrinking. And unfortunately, if you can't see electricity and alloys, the era they're in, right, which is tiny. This is the larger point. How are you going to convey this? And the raw materials question from this is this. This is, the world in your phone, right? Where does your phone come from? America's got a lot of raw materials, folks, but we can't do some of the specific stuff we can't do some of the specific stuff that, are cutting edge, aspects of the modern world, or even some basic parts. But, the telephone being one. You could still do this except for the mobile phone, right? Hubbard goes around kind of passing out material. Buell is part of this too. He actually creates a couple of smaller organizations that go out into the South and West as well and convene not only elites, but regular people. That's one part of this. But Hubbard comes back. And I love this. She says, well, there actually is isolation out there when you talk to these people, but it's often very economically based. They're worried about this and they're worried about competition. They're worried about what the reciprocal trade agreements that Hull's doing are going to do to their, whatever part of their largely agricultural economy. They're not thinking about this as like, wow, we've got to stay out of the trade war. They're thinking in economic terms, and they're thinking in terms of some of the lessons and some of the pain from the Depression. And one of the things, she comes back and she does a set of pamphlets that they reprint all through the 40s. Program in World Interdependence. This is just my favorite one. which is ties that bind, but it's telling regular people, right? That's the goal. And particularly women are a particular target, right? She's a woman, she's sensitive to this. But a lot of these organizations are very conscious that women are a large part of their audience. And it is that, in your, it's not only your car or your phone that depends on the world economy. It's, it's your pantry, it's your household, it's your hat, right? And to John, a shout to Australia. And you can't have a fashionable hat without the world economy. And my point here is not that they win the day and the American people care about the world in a way. I think there's largely the American public is very hard to move on these things over time. But one of the things that this does when you see all the things that are happening, it's not as simple as saying there's no interest. These ideas aren't present. They are very present. They are very much moving around. And since I'm very low on time, I want to just say quickly, because this was one of the things that kind of got tacked on in the paper, but is about radio. That gets to some of these elements is that radio hits with a splash in 1920, becomes a broadcast medium, even though I'm short on time. The broadcast is an agricultural, I love this, the agricultural term of image of a farmer throwing seeds out like that. For all of it connects not only with, the concept of a mass society, but also propaganda and other things that had come out roaring out of the Great War of how can societies be manipulated. This also very much segues into an understanding that the dictator states, the totalitarian states, use basically public relations as part of the ways they achieve power and stay in power. Radio has an enormous impact. There's an arrival of a lot of different programming, some of it connected to this adult education. There's a thing that just a surprise for me that this was a new thing, but forums of the air of having a bunch of people sitting and talking about world affairs, like 2 or 3 people, sitting talking about an issue. These become some of the highest rated shows of the time: America's Town Meeting of the Air, University of Chicago Roundtable. I actually shouldn't say the highest, but they get significant ratings. Often, millions of people. They need to be stocked with people to have these conversations. Buell and McDonald and other people are kind of the cadre who do this. Also, these organizations like the FBA use radio. They gravitate toward it. It also leads to a lot of research, which leads back to the universities. Princeton, for example, gets a lot of money from Rockefeller to study radio. And I'll hurry through this. You guys may know this, but when the Martians land in 1938, they land like right over there. And the irony is there's a radio research station right somewhere over here, right under Hadley Cantrell. I mean, there's the irony of like, the invaders land with where the people are going to, the thing that's going to resist the invasion from Mars is going to be Cantrell's radio researchers. And that famously is why almost immediately there's research done on how people reacted to this, because this gets to the whole question of propaganda and how mass societies can be manipulated. It also gets to a thing about competition between print media and broadcast media. Print media, by the way, being much more conservative. Just if you can see, when they do the surveys, most of the people surveyed go, we didn't think we were under attack by Martians. We thought we were under attack by Germans. Japanese, there's another survey they do, which I just think is really funny. There's one person who thinks it's the Italians. But like, or it's an act of God, right? It's a natural disaster. And part of this is cracked up to the Depression too. That forgotten in this is Cantrell and his researchers say at the end, well, you know what this is? It's that people are insecure. They've been thrown into chaos by being in a troublesome world over the past decade. And anything's bound to happen, right? People are more susceptible because of the immediate past. not just this revolutionary technology, epoch-making technology, the immediate past. All right, and I'll wrap up. But radio is a segue to media, where Buell gets tired of being an FBA. There's maybe a little story to that. I don't know clearly, but he's 21. He goes to he moves into Luce's empire, becomes the head of the editor of the roundtables for Fortune magazine. He gets to do adult education on the business class by doing these roundtables a couple times a year, where he gets important people together, kind of has a couple of outliers left and right, that kind of tells you what the conventional wisdom is. And the conventional wisdom is usually much more interventionist or globalist, right? When you're talking about internationalists, they're talking about everything from taxation, but they talk about world order twice before the U.S. fits in the war. To my point, just in terms of ideas migrating right, is that, he has, as a colleague, we'll talk about him in a second, but like Fortune very much takes on that the U.S. has a mission. By the beginning of the war, they put out an issue on the United States, but there's a section of it that's basically like, yeah, things are completely different, and the U.S. has a project, and one of the key part of this project is a Pax Americana. And this is February 1940 in Fortune. And this comes right as Buell himself is giving speeches, a series of lectures at Tufts, not to be too terribly parochial, where he's saying things, basically, what's going to become a book to advocate for a greater American role. And one of the things he says that, basically all of these problems have come out over the last decade. He summarizes a lot of the things I've just put in front of you, and says, pointedly, the time has come to stop dodging the issue and to make up our minds to withdraw completely from the world, or to make it over as we want it to be. And that's something that comes out of his thinking over the preceding 10 years, but very much over the preceding 6 months, right? I mean, he's got that laid out before the war starts. I know I keep promising to get, but the roundtables become a means for him to meet critical political figures, important people. He already knew a lot of these people. That's one of the reasons they hired him. But Mitch Davenport, he calls himself a rabid interventionist. He's his editor-in-chief. They both meet Wendell Willkie. They both end up advising. I'll say this, there's a lot of Wendell Willkie's had like a great decade. Like he's had 2 really great biographies, he's being reconsidered. But there's this kind of head scratching that the biographies do, is like, where did some of his ideas come from? Civil rights, more, a more engaged America, like out of this. And it's like, well, because his key advisors, I don't think he was an empty shirt. But Willkie had 2 advisors who were globalists. I mean, in the sense that they were already talking about a global America. This is also something where the totalitarian formulation, where Buell actually very, it isn't a love fest between Willkie and FDR. FDR is basically accused of being a proto-totalitarian by the Willkie campaign, in certain ways. We can talk more about that. It's a little bit strong, but they do say, 3 terms. We've got a dictator. All of this is that when Willkie loses, his ideas don't lose, because Luce keeps talking about America as a project. And then when he, in the middle of the Lend-Lease battle in 1941, comes out and says, it's American century. If you read the American century, it's got that wonderful Luce of random stuff of Fury of Hissing Geese, but it's also very much something that tracks from a lot of these earlier ideals. Luce is, to borrow from recent scholarship on American politics, this is movement conservatism in the 1930s and 40s. Luce is sitting on the stage with Willkie. The Sean Hannity movement. Very much these ideas have moved into the right, into a quadrant of the right. They're not argued about. But the final point here is that when Beard's book comes out in 1939, it's reviewed. Right. as we all hope. And in fact, as publishers love and various outlets love to do, like, let's set two contrary views against each other. And several places, Buell versus Beard, and the fundamentalist versus the modernist. You can guess who it's who, but in one of these reviews, Beard is just taken to task. He's like, I's just kind of spouting on against data and statistics and serious, on a guy who gets that things have changed. It's not just old form diplomacy. It's radio. It's this, and this, and it's that the fundamentalist Beard loses out to the modernist view. But of course, this review is in Time magazine. And I always love the Buell stuff, that kind of smirk, fixes in. But that said, it's that when Beard comes out with this, there's already a ready-made critique, right? He gets smacked around by the Time Life machine because those ideas they've already migrated into them. Because they followed Buell to where he went. I've already gone on too long, but the larger point is that these globalist ideas are not just out there. Like, some people say, oh, Luce was ahead, or this figure was ahead. Thinking in these terms, they were lonely. You're not lonely if Time Inc. is supporting these views, and the Foreign Policy Association is advocating them. And you can walk into a library in Montana and find a lot of these publications. Doesn't mean they carry all before them, but it also means some of the things that historians, again, scratch their heads about. It's like, why is there all of this organizing in the 1940s about post-war planning and this and this and this, in small scale and by these civil society groups? Because they were already doing it in the 1930s. Because a lot of these ideas were already institutionalized and had a lot of credibility in a lot of different spaces. So I'll leave it there. Sorry to go on.
Terrific. Thank you so much. This is great, and we're going to open it up for conversation. I might just start by asking a question. You've shown us that there is a lot of intellectual ferment in the 30s going into the war, that internationalism is alive and well and being redefined. Some of the protagonists in your story are Wilsonians who have been kind of hit by a new reality, the Great Depression, the kind of the new era of global politics that Wilson and the earlier period, including the League period, weren't really preparing for it. So there's a new shock of the new, and that's clearly part of the background that it motivating the activities and the thinking of the people you look at. I would be very interested in how that group of Wilsonians are updating their view. Are they much more now focused on political economy and the sheer complexity and density of economic interdependence, resource interdependence? Is simply the industrial modernity has ratcheted itself up, and we need to update our internationalism, and in doing so, it becomes globalism. Is this a story of reconsidering and updating by internationalists who have been around all along, but are now redeveloping their ideas?
Yeah, I mean, and to take that other formulation is like a globalist is a Wilsonian mugged by reality, right? And in the 1930s, you could make that case. I mean, that there is something a lot of these people do. I mean, some of them come out of are Wilsonians in a very real sense, not in the generic way we sometimes use it today. Some of them worked with Wilson or were on the inquiry. I actually got a tidbit that maybe even Wertheimer worked. Some of them just doesn't get credit because she's a woman. But there is an update. And there is something profoundly different. And what I find actually interesting is when we often go back and talk about these people as Wilsonians, they don't see themselves as like, they even necessarily referencing Wilson or seeing themselves as kind of heirs to Wilson per se, right? They're not calling themselves Wilsonians, right? As we would. But they would say, yeah, we share a lot of what Wilson was trying to do. A lot of them, you know, even if they don't like the league as it exists, they like the idea of the league. But what I think is the shift, and why they're so jarred by the Depression is an understanding, like you were saying, that the industrial modernity and an integrated globe, right? An increasingly tiny and integrated globe, that once that starts to fray, that's a real problem. And the intensity of that something had, something historical has shifted. That's a big part of it. I would also say too, and you can find this, and there's some wonderful work on Wilson and how Wilson thinks about, like Germany, right? That if Germany wins, it's a militarist society, it's going to set Europe out of kilter, and that will be bad for us. And a lot of what's being said in the 30s and 40s, even some stuff in the Cold War, sounds remarkably familiar. But the difference with totalitarianism is something that has to do, I think, a little bit of the mix with the social sciences that have fledged. And again, the intensity of what's happening around them, that it's not just the Kaiser, it's not one regime, right? Because a number of these regimes have sprouted up. This is something that can happen. It's a condition of modernity. It's something, I think, in fact, that's been inscribed onto us, right? That we assume that this can come around kind of anywhere, right? I mean, whenever we, our own politics today, but like the assumption that, like, when we talk about various governments, getting elected in Europe or Asia, that there's a sense that, this can come back. And I think that's the shift. It's not a particular threat. It's that we have this thing that we define, that increasingly becomes labeled with what, fascists want to label themselves, totalitarians. This kind of mutation is a permanent condition that can crop up if the world gets out of whack, and therefore you have to have someone making sure the world doesn't get out of whack. And that, because of our economic power and, our political, cultural, economic power, not quite our military power, we are best positioned.
Sure. Over here, and then we'll come around.
This isn't my field, so this question may be a little simplistic, but are they viewing global economic integration as a means or an end? They almost sound, in the way that they're combining these ideas with ideas of freedom and democracy, they sound like forerunners of neoliberalism.
Yeah, it's actually a really good question. And it's general, but yeah, and this is something, forgive me for getting on a hobby horse and riding it a little bit, but very often it is, and some of them actually are, but not all of them are, when they say these things that sound to us like, oh, this is, this is like the, Hayek before Hayek, liberty, and, individualism and things like this. It's actually people who are actually kind of liberals who are terrified that their system is going down. And it's not necessarily, because then some of those people will, out of the other side of their mouth, talk about like planning and a new deal for the world, or, some sort of ameliorative kind of social democratic kind of thing. It's more about like, can we have liberty and some of these elements? But it is that the larger question about integration is less that they are trying to do it, but they see it also as a condition of industrial modernity, that the industrial revolution is the thing. I mean, what is remarkable, and like I pull out Dean and Wertheimer, but I mean, I have a kind of I kind of tossed in a section about Harold Lasswell, so it's in political science. Dean Acheson is saying the same thing in the 1930s, kind of policy. You're finding a lot of people saying the big thing that happened was the Industrial Revolution, and all these things came from it. And one of the things was it got us, as we would say, the arrival of the global market, right? An integrated global market. And what we're seeing is this has hit the wall. And what does it mean that it's even going in reverse? Lasswell even says something like that. Like, it's going in one direction, now it seems to be going backwards. So it's the condition of that integration that then you have to think, well, how do we facilitate that? And one of the things about that raw materials and all that argument about the world economy is, well, how do we keep the world economy kind of running in an effective way? And there are a lot of things that people are saying. One of the things that I had to hurry past when you talk about this time, and please stop me, like I said, in this moment, is that one of the counterpoints is, well, the U.S. should be self-contained. Right? One of the reasons I bring Beard out is Beard writes a couple of books, talk about continentalism. There are actually movements and people, various interests and others saying, the U.S. should be a self-contained economy. And that's the way we survive it. And this is happening internationally. Tara Zahra had a really good book on this. But even on a larger level, they're debating this. The response is we can be self-contained. And the fear for some people who are not even, again, Hayek before Hayek, are, well, that's going to kind of codify this fragmentation. It even might replicate the politics of the dictator states, which like autarky. What we need to keep the global economy moving, because the global economy is just kind of a reality, right? Modernity can't function without some kind of integrate. And then you find like people choosing down to particular things where you have Buell, who's like, can't get enough of the reciprocal trade program with Cordell Hull, which is about, bilateral trade treaties. And it sounds incredibly boring, but there are people who are just like, if you walked into a room in 1938 and mentioned, the RTP, people go like, revivalist, and I'm only slightly exaggerating. Buell wants Hull to run for president, because he's talking about this. And that's a long-winded way of saying what they want is political solutions that accept that sort of modern integrated world economy and foster it.
Heather?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I enjoyed reading the check as well. I wanted to ask about where exactly you find this idea of kind of an existential fear emerging. You say a lot of these figures are talking about the dark side of modernity, like the modernity gone bad of Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. But in the rest of the piece, I wasn't quite seeing how this was endangering U.S. security. And what I mean by that is, I think the raw material story made a lot of sense about, like, within the Lasswell piece, talking about, Germany or Italy requiring more raw materials, and kind of moving outward from there. And then there was this mass politics piece also I thought was in there. You talked about one of your figures saying, like, there will be a revolution here if we don't fix this. But I don't quite locate the existential fear about other regimes as opposed to like seeing what's happening and trying to address that role without these necessarily being connected to like a learning rather than cause and effect.
Yeah.
And to build a little bit more on the mass politics piece, I thought the locating of this growth of internationalism or globalism at this associational level here was really interesting, and the movement of ideas among those and the foundation that's created there. But I'm also wondering why the specific focus on these associations and not more broadly. So thinking about like, how would you put your work in conversation with like this audience perspective on these ideas coming from the fall of empire, being in this like more elite circle beyond that, and also like where are the labor unions, where it's churches?
No, absolutely. Why these organizations as opposed to others? Yeah. Good question. All good questions and all fair questions. and there's a lot there.
Yes.
No, but fair point. And some of this is just, these are things, I'll say these will be dealt with in other forms. Part of it is seeing, the choice in the organizations is seeing organizations that were trying to reach the public. Slobodian's book, I really like that book. But that is, and he does talk about how transmitted and, these ideas from these thinkers get into institutions because there are political reasons to do this. And I would say that some of that is part of this too, right? I'm trying to do a similar thing. And this is what historians do, right? That I am saying, well, yeah, and they are getting into where you don't think they get to, which is the political right. And also saying that, some of these ideas that when you, again, like I was saying before, when you're talking about like, oh, let's liberalize the world economy or maintain capitalist, exchange and free trade, it sounds like you're talking like a Reaganite. But for people in the 30s and 40s, you can be a New Dealer and be doing, right? You can be Henry Wallace and be doing. And I don't know if that entirely gets to what you're saying on the Slobodian front, but on the threat, that's where I was just emphasizing, it was already too long of a paper, is that the threat is built into, well, the totalitarians, if they get what they want, or we allow the fragmentation of the global economy to continue, we will get an unbalanced world that will affect us. Right? It's already, Buell is actually saying in 39 things to the effect of, things have been happening for the past decade. They've affected Europe and Asia, and they're starting to happen. And that's the sort of generalized kind of, if you will, specter of totalitarianism, that it might come here in some form. But there's also the formulation that begins to emerge in the social sciences that, well, totalitarian states are aggressive. They are internally aggressive, therefore they will be externally aggressive. And they're going to come for us. And one of the things that you start to see, and one of the difficulties of this project is there are people who are not worried that, Germany's going to attack us. They're worried about, kind of a collapse of liberalism. Liberalism won't deliver the goods, it will kind of fail. Not that the Germans are coming, but then there are other people who are literally saying the Nazis have a plan and they are coming, and they are maybe not coming for us directly, but they are coming for, they're going to remake the European order. They may want to remake other parts of the world order, and that's no good for us because that will eventually affect us. And that's where the threat is. And it's a little more diffuse. It becomes more and more, and more and more clearly stated as you approach the war, and then once the war begins. But it's an outgrowth of like these things that are percolating. So, did I get to it?
John?
Thanks so much, David. Also, presentation. I have a very straightforward question, which is the type of American globalism you're talking about just liberal internationalism?
For John's question, in a sense, yes. But it's a variation of it, or if you want to say it's a mutation of it in response to the depression. But it is highest state of liberal internationalism, or a branch of it, right? You could argue that there are other people who say, oh, we shouldn't be going in this direction, or we should be doing this in this way. But it very much draws from those traditions that comes out of it. And the distinction, I would say, is that what you have by, even in the middle of the 1930s, you have people saying the U.S. has to use its power to guarantee this. And I would also say, if you're Vera Dean, that woman puts on brass knuckles in 1935. She's like, we may have to fight for this, right? If we value this. It's almost like out of, forgive me for going into this, but she writes this, which I quote, she writes this thing that's almost like out of a sci-fi movie, like the others didn't fight and this mutated force came for them and destroyed them. And we may have to decide if we need to fight with force to defend ourselves. And that goes to perhaps both of your questions, where the threat is, and like that this is liberal internationalism, but it's, you know, liberal internationalism, you know, locked in Dean's sense, locked and loaded, perhaps. I don't know if that's, were you looking for something?
I mean, maybe as well, one way to think about it is, it kind of sounds like all these people agree on what the problem is. Do they all advocate the same solution, and is that solution liberal internationalism?
The solution is an American power applied within an internationalist frame, and that can vary. I mean, again, this is one of the things that sometimes, you know, people go, well, this person's saying it this way, and I'm like, well, yes, but they're part of a larger conversation that's saying a variety of different things, just like we do today. Like, what would your policy toward the Ukraine be, U.S. and Ukraine, or any kind of issue you might have something that varies in a way, but would still be different. But what is changing, and I mean, particularly when you get down to Buell and others, and part of the reason I talk about raw materials is that, you know, the U.S. is bound up in this conversation. It can't get out of it, right? We're kind of mired in the world, in a modern world economy. And one of the things a lot of them understand is we are the Leviathan, and we have to be involved. And there are some who are just, you know, we have to be involved. We have to be part of the solution. Increasingly, it becomes the U.S. has to use its power to kind of, kind of accept the role it's been given. I mean, you see the evolution of an international trope that we still use today. It's like, you know, with great power comes great responsibility, right? It's a Spider-Man question. But in all seriousness, we have been given this massive, particularly economic power, and we have to wield it, because if we don't, the world economy won't work. These other things will fall apart. What then drags some people like Buell and others back to an internationalist tradition is they're often saying that, well, that can be done collaboratively, as we would talk about a Wilsonian today, collaboratively through an international organization. Like Buell is very late to give up the lead. We can do it through these various things. I mean, one of the things that isolationists are even arguing about, some people that are being critical and saying the U.S. shouldn't be doing this or that, right? Arguing it's this or that policy on the economy, are worried about the U.S. getting too involved in organizations like this. And the internationalists are saying, well, if one of the ways we can bring stability to, again, very often they're focused on the world economy, is to collaborate, is to go to this conference, is to do more with the lead, then let's do that.
Please.
Yeah, thanks. I guess just following on this strand, I'm still left with a little bit of uncertainty about whether or not there's a diversity of solutions kind of on tap under the ceiling of liberalism. So the gold standard, I guess, goes away in the story. Are they nostalgic about the gold standard, or are they? It's just kind of one. Yeah. Like there's using American power, but to what end? What kind of form does it take? There's national planning, there's international planning. So can you flesh out a little bit more? Sure. Yes, no, and that's a good question. Sometimes it is a little vague, right? I mean, what they're saying is we'd like this, and some of it, some of this is a moving target, right? That things evolve, but there's less about when some of the figures I'm looking at, like you won't find Luce and his guys after, Luce takes a turn in like 36, 37, by them really talking about the gold standard per se as the solution. You won't find Buell and others dealing with it. What you will find is that, and it goes to kind of a, either it's let's do something internationally to govern, say, raw materials as part of peaceful change. For example, for a while they go round and round talking about, like, we could have a conference, or we could have some sort of regime or organization that hands out raw materials to people. That's kind of the international solution. You still find people talking about that well into, and it's something that's kind of quietly, in certain ways, kind of discussed with the UN, right? How do we have things that could potentially have levers on it? But not to dwell too much on the reciprocal trade pacts and agreements and RTA or RGPA, however you want to phrase them, is that, again, goes to American power, right? The U.S. is the biggest economy. If we start going around and negotiating treaties that get, that kind of rationalize and get rid of some of this wasteful competition and difficulties that the world economy has had, we can change things, right? It's less maybe like, oh, let's get everybody back on gold. It's let's get a more rationalized trade system. But for these Americans, and one of the things too, one of the things I didn't touch on is there are people internationally who are like, yeah, the Americans have got to do it. From my previous book, I mean, there are a number of Australians, New Zealanders, people in the Dominions who are like, yeah, breaking it. It's America. And that's the thing. It's American power through something like the reciprocal trade pacts that can be used. It's never the most exciting answer, but it's a profound answer.
One more question, and then I have a question as well. But Lynn?
Thank you. My question is about, so earlier questions you talked about how the U.S. assessed threat or how these intellectuals advocate for the U.S. interests to have a global role. But how do they make internal assessment about the U.S. authority to play a role in global affairs? Because you can be powerful, but it doesn't necessarily mandate the state to have a global role instead of just vilifying the threat or the.
Yeah.
So what is the source of
that's a really good question. It's for why should we do this? Why should we nominate ourselves?
Just because you mentioned Americans already saw themselves as liberal by then. So.
Yeah, and there is a little bit of
That's a great title.
Yeah. Really good question. There actually is, I will say two things, is that sometimes it's non-reflective. It's we're powerful, we should do this, right? There are things and that can be, I mean, just not to be parochial, many countries will do that, but the US is particularly guilty of being we think this is the right thing, we have the power to do it. Right? But I think it comes tempered in part of some of my caution about reading a little too much of this is neoliberalism starting to germinate. As much as this is the hyper confidence about sort of the American project, you can read somebody like Luce, and that is hyper confidence about the American project. But there's also part of this, and I hope you see this as answering your question, that is a lot of anxiety about liberalism itself. Can liberalism actually do this? Can liberalism actually deal with the problems of the modern world? And there's actually a little more pause, particularly in the first half of the Depression, among some of these figures of, what do we have to reform about liberalism and the United States to do this? One of the things about Buell is he's never a dyed-in-the-wool New Dealer, but there's a lot of stuff that comes out of FPA and a number of other organizations that are very excited about New Deal, not quite saying New Deal for the world, but it gets to, we can use planning and we can kind of rationalize parts of the international economy on this or that basis, and that will get rid of the excesses of laissez-faire capitalism, particularly on a global frame, and that's how we can proceed, right? And we may be the mechanism to implement that sort of regime. So, there is some reflection on what it actually is. And that is actually what I find actually so compelling about this period as a historian. It's that the liberals, there are people who write about this period about they were gearing up for this or this and this and this, the hyper confidence. And there's actually a lot more things just went really bad and the world went off the rails and it's really our fault because we were kind of in charge. And our system doesn't work, and how do we make it work? So a lot of reflection.
This has been very interesting. Just a couple last reflections. I think there is a lingering question that I hear from the questions that were asked about what kind of international order they wanted to build and how the U.S. might play a role, indeed a leading role in it. Is it the U.S. On one hand creating institutions that then invite everybody in? That's the United Nations project, or a more hegemonic project. We're going to run things. It's going to be a Washington project as opposed to a global Geneva project. There clearly were different views about this. Some were more hegemonic, some were more multilateral, universal institutions. But the other lingering question for me is that they weren't one voice, and your different profiles are very interesting because they show different features. You get some are worried about the future of social democracy. I mean, Vera Dean is clearly of that sort, that democracy has to be saved, has to be reinvented. The democratic way of life is under threat, and we need to make it more viable because the alternatives are knocking at the door, totalitarian fascist alternatives. So it really is a democracy problem that industrial modernity is generating. But others who kind of are part of this migration to the right are really interested in big business and how American corporations in this new era have to be able to have access to the world for markets and resources. So Wendell Willkie is, it's Republican internationalism.
Yeah.
It's fairly conservative, but and in some ways, that's the free trade, that's the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. That is that side, not the Keynesian, we're going to manage a world economy to stabilize boom and bust. So it seems to me that what's interesting is not that there's a new global vision. There are multiple visions, but the old internationalism coming out of Wilson's era, there are new threads that are being created and then woven into this internationalist coalition. Republicans and conservatives who weren't in the time of Wilson even thinking about the world are now, for pecuniary reasons, clearly, we've got to make this thing stable because we're more interdependent than we thought we were. And there's opportunities, but there's also threats. But they're sitting alongside social democrats who are just enthralled by the New Deal and want to bring it to the world. So I guess, it seems to me, to kind of wrap up here, there's a lot of coalition coalition building intellectually and politically that is at the core of your story.
Yeah, and that was worth the price of my train ticket to get down. We had coalition building in that sense. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it quite that way. Exactly. And what can be less than satisfying when you present all of this kind of mountain of people and institutions and say, well, the core thing is that they've come to, over this intense period, that the U.S. has to be more actively involved. Do they all agree about everything in particular, in specifics? And do they have a plan? Is there one kind of thing where they're going to march out? Some people are still kind of clinging. Maybe we can do something with the lead. Some are seeing that. Luce is often set up as, he's saying this is the job for the U.S. and the U.S. kind of maybe not alone, but as the prime mover. But the bigger thing I see is a move away from that this is maybe something we do kind of as part of the club of great powers, big empires, however you want to frame it, or as part of an international community. It's where the U.S. has to be, if maybe not the prime mover, the inter pares, right? And again, they don't have a clear plan other than what came before doesn't work, and the U.S. has to be very actively involved. But you're absolutely right; it's mixed in with shades of social democracy, the New Deal. You do have people saying proto around Luce. You see the rise of parts of the America, in the early 40s of like the New Deal is, is totalitarianism. It could potentially, it's the road to serfdom in so many words, right? But yeah, but what it all amounts to is a departure, and a departure where the U.S. has to lead the train.
Well, on that note, this has been a road to a very interesting conversation. So not to serfdom, but to enlightenment. Let's call it.
It's road to world order.
Well, there we have it. So let's thank David for a terrific talk, and really glad to have you.
And thank you all. Great questions. Thank you so much.